In verse 25, the Jews of Banu Af, which is one of the tribes there, are a community along with the believers. To the Jews, their religion, and to the Muslims, their religion. So basically it's saying, everybody, you go believe what you want. This document has nothing to do with religious belief. This applies both to their clients and to themselves. And the term client here is a reference to the pagan tribes. The way the community was structured is that there was a client-patron relationship between the dominant tribes and the lesser tribes. And the pagan tribes there were all clients of either the Jewish tribes or the Muslim tribes. So depending upon who you were a client of, you were then also bound to this agreement. So what I would say is that if you look at this agreement in detail and actually analyze it, which is really beyond the scope of this discussion, and actually I'm not even sure what this even has to do with the issue of democracy per se. It has something to do with liberalism, but not so much with democracy necessarily. I would conclude that the Compact of Medina actually is a very liberal document if you look at it from its date and time. One does not analyze Thomas Jefferson based on the fact that he kept slaves. We look at him in the context of his date and time too. And I think that if you look at this in that context, I think that the document is actually very forward-thinking.
Let me, before you go, let me ask that question one more time to clarify. Dr. Ali mentioned, what does this discussion have to do with democracy in Islam? It's a very good point. Does Islam regard non-Muslims being allies as second-class citizens? Does it imply that within an Islamic state, one religious affiliation rather than one justice? Sean, how is this related to democracy in Islam?
I am certainly the least qualified person in the room, if not the campus, or in all of Orange County, to discuss theological components of the Quran. You know, like any other complicated document, you're going to find lots of internal inconsistencies in what appears to be inconsistent. You're going to have people, theologians, arguing over a word or a sentence, and it's endless how many angels stand on the head of a pen. And I'm much more interested in behavior. You know, I love the documents, you know, but you know, the U.S. Constitution is just a few pages. And, you know, there's more paper written on the Constitution to fill this campus. So I'm much more interested in the application. I have three observations on this point about these particular verses here. I just don't think I'm going to be spending a lot of time reading the Quran to really try to decipher. Listen, I'm very bad. I haven't even read the Old Testament, except you know some of the racier sections and the New Testament. You know, when I was growing up, but, you know, what my observation is, some 700 years after the birth of Christ, Muhammad arises. And it seems like he was quite a qualitatively different person. Born in violence, he was a warrior, he was a conqueror. He certainly treated his enemies rather harshly. I think one of the stories that really stuck in my mind is that, you know, is how he had some 30 enemies, you know, that apparently killed some of his people in an ambush. And so he got them back and he cut off their hands and put them drinking water and, you know, slow torture. And that seemed to be, you know, a big part of the theological background. It's certainly much different than the New Testament. So, you know, how did that happen 700 years after Christ? I can understand that 700 years before Christ. But the bigger question is the second-class citizenship. And the fact is, a lot of majoritarian societies treat the non-believers or the non-ethnic group as second-class citizens. We've certainly seen that in the Christian world, we've seen that in the secular world, we've seen that in the racial world. But the fact is that Demitude is an ancient institution, starting from Muhammad, that if you're a non-believer, you have three choices if you're a non-believer, if I could add this right. One, you can convert. That's your favorite methodology. Two, then you pay taxes and you're oppressed and you're limited where you can live, the kind of work that you can do. Or three, you can get killed. It's a pretty harsh policy, but that's something that seems inherent. And again, I look at the behavior, not interested in the theology of the Compact of Medina or the Sermon on the Mount, but I think it's something that we can't divorce ourselves from. And you'll see that these theological states are inherently anti-human freedom, particularly the theological state in Iran. It's just an awful and wicked place. We saw what happened in Afghanistan. Now in parts of northern and northwestern Pakistan, they have various semi-Islamic states where, you know, again, if women aren't clothed from head to foot, if girls can't go to a school of any kind, they can't even leave the house without one of their male relatives. In Saudi Arabia, you know, much more enlightened country, women are not allowed to drive a car or appear or walk by themselves. So, you know, it's a primitivism that's anti-modern, then I'm hoping that the values of the West ultimately penetrate into the Middle East, where they can catch up, with the medieval behavior that is used in the name of Islam. So I have no actual criticism against the religion or against the word itself. I'm just looking at the behavior of how people use that, what they do with their lives. But from the theological point of view, I'll ask my colleague, Dr. Sultan. She's actually read the book in Arabic.
In Islam, there is a special section when Muslims are taught to be loyal only to their Islam and only to their fellow Muslims. No matter how long they live in a country or how much help they receive from that country, they will be always loyal only to their Islam and only to their fellow Muslims. Any agreement they make with an infidel can be broken or disregarded once they are strong enough to take over the infidel. Also, in Islam, there is a very well-known concept called al-taqiyya, which allows Muslims to lie, cheat, deceive, and hide their feeling in order to achieve their goal. The underlying foundation of Islam is to take over the world. Every Muslim believes that no justice will be served until Islam takes over. I'm going to read some Quranic verses for you. Chapter 8, verse 12 states, I will cast terror into the hearts of the disbelievers, so strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them. Some people argue that there are some peaceful teachings in Islam. You need to know that Quran was written in 2 times of Muhammad's life. When he was in Mecca, he was very weak, only very few followers behind him. So he adopted some kind of peaceful teachings, and they were taken from the Christian and the Jewish Bible. When he moved to Al-Madinah, he established a very strong army and appointed himself the head of that army. And he said, the previous teachings are cancelled. And he adopted very, very violent teachings. That's why in order, you need to educate yourself about Islam. You need to educate yourself about the Quran. Even though the Quran in Islam is forbidden to be translated to any language. If you read the English copy of Quran, look at the cover, you will see the meaning of our holy book. It is not the literal translation. But even if you read it in English, you will know much more about Islam. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to do something a little extra, if you don't mind. It's clearly almost a one-sided discussion up here. And I would, if you don't mind, folks, I would like to give Dr. Ali a couple extra more minutes to come back to some of the statements that were made here. Dr. Ali?
Well, unfortunately, Sean here, I think, is not a scholar of Islam, certainly not a scholar of Muslim history. Some of these stories that he tells are things that I've never even heard of. I've never heard some of these stories that he relates about what Muslims do or have done, or what the Prophet did or hasn't done. So I would dispute a lot of the statements that he made there as just historically false. In the case of Dr. Sultan there, my understanding is she grew up in Syria. Syria is run by the Alawite, Hafiz al-Assad and his small clique there. They are not Islamic fundamentalists. They are a secular Ba'athist party. They are the Syrian Ba'ath Party, which was very closely allied to the Iraqi Ba'ath Party of Saddam Hussein. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, which is the Islamist party in Syria, tried to rise up and overthrow Hafiz al-Assad. And in 1982, he wiped out the town of Hama, killed 20,000 people, and destroyed the Muslim Brotherhood there. So I'm not sure how the Muslim Brotherhood was able to impose Sharia law on Syria when they got killed by Hafiz al-Assad and his system of secular Baathism. So I think that the story of what she tells about what happened to her family and all that, they're terrible things, and my heart goes out to her and her family, and I regret those things, but I would not say that they are due to Islam or Muslims. I think that they are due to her personal experiences in Syria.